They said the richest man in the county had his pick of any woman in town. Yet on that scorching afternoon, he walked past silk dresses, polite smiles, and perfect reputations, straight into a shack filled with steam and suffering. What he offered there wasn't love, not at first. It was a deal, a strange, unsettling deal that no one could understand. But sometimes the most unexpected choices hide the deepest truths and the most dangerous secrets. Stay with me, because this story isn't just about a marriage. It's about redemption, silence, and the price of a soul.
That Tuesday afternoon, the wealthiest man in Young County did something Fort Griffin's high society would never, ever forgive. He walked right past 3 shaded porches heavy with the perfume of marriageable daughters. He walked past the banker's piano-playing girl, past the judge's niece from Boston, past the preacher's own daughter, standing there in her Sunday blue. He didn't stop. He didn't tip his hat. He just kept walking. He walked until the boardwalk ended and the dirt began. He stopped at a tin-roof shack at the edge of town, a place hot as a furnace. Inside, a widow was plunging her bare hands into boiling lye water, scrubbing the dirt out of the undergarments of those very same parlor girls. He took off his hat. He pulled out a small chalkboard. And what he wrote on it, well, it ignited a war that would last straight through the winter. Mercy Calloway didn't look up when the shadow fell across her doorway. She just kept scrubbing. Her hands were raw, red, cracked down to the knuckles from the harsh soap. Her boy, Toby, was sitting in the corner. 7 years old, stacking firewood, quiet as a mouse. He had a summer cough that just wouldn't quit, not in this damp, suffocating heat. "Just leave it in the basket, sir," Mercy said. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with a damp forearm. "Pickup is on Friday." But the man didn't move. There was no sound of boots turning away. Just silence. Mercy sighed. She looked up, and the breath hitched right in her throat. It was Silas Thorne. They called him the Silent King of Thorne Acres. 12,000 acres of prime Texas grass. The biggest cattle herd in the county, a man with dark hair graying at the temples, and shoulders broad enough to carry the world. And he hadn't spoken a single word out loud in 6 long years. Mercy stood up fast. She wiped her hands on her apron, quickly, trying to hide the redness, trying to hide the ugly, healing scars. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. His gray eyes just took her in. The tired lines around her mouth, the faded black of her morning dress. Then he reached into his dark coat. He pulled out a slate chalkboard and a piece of white chalk. He wrote something down, slow, deliberate, and turned it around for her to see. "I need a wife, legal, before God and the law. I will provide a home, food, schooling for your boy. My name, separate rooms. No demands. You may leave after 1 year with $500 in a wagon." Mercy stared at the board. The lye water dripped from her apron onto the dirt floor. Drop. Drop. It was the only sound in the room. $500. It was a fortune. It was medicine for Toby. It was a train ticket anywhere. It was freedom. She looked up from the board, right into those storm-gray eyes. "Why?" Her voice shook, just a little. "Why me? There are a dozen women in this town who would kill for that land." Silas didn't blink. He wiped the slate clean with his thumb. He raised the chalk, and he wrote again. Just one sentence. "Because you are the only person in this town whose money I have never taken." Mercy didn't understand what that meant. Not then. She didn't know about the ghosts he was carrying. She didn't know about the bones buried on his land. Silas wiped the board one last time. "Think on it. If yes, the Methodist Chapel, Sunday at 10. He didn't wait for an answer. He put the chalk in his pocket, put his hat back on, and turned away. Stepping back out into the blinding Texas sun, Mercy stood there in the steam, alone. She looked at her raw, burning hands. Then she looked at the doorway where the richest man in Texas had just stood. wondering if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life, or if she had finally found a way to save it. Sunday morning came. Hot, stifling. The kind of heat that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Mercy stood in front of her cracked mirror. She smoothed the front of her dress. It was black, faded at the seams. It was the dress she'd buried her first husband in 2 years ago. It was the only decent thing she owned. She looked at her hands. The redness was still there. The cracks. The chemical burns from the lye soap. She tried to rub a little bacon grease into the worst of the cracks to soften them. It didn't help much. Toby tugged at her skirt. His face was scrubbed clean, his hair slicked down with water. "Are we really going, Mama?" "We are, baby." Mercy took a breath. "Stand tall today. Don't look at the ground." They walked the half-mile to the Methodist chapel. The walk felt like 100 miles. Fort Griffin was awake. People were standing on the boardwalks, outside the mercantile, outside the bank. And they were watching. They didn't just watch. They whispered. The sound of it was like dry leaves scraping across a porch, hissing, venomous. "Look at her, the washerwoman, trapping a cripple. Must have used roots. Or spells. Must have. He can't even speak to defend himself." Mercy held Toby's hand tighter. She kept her chin up, her spine straight. She didn't look left. She didn't look right. She just kept her eyes on the white steeple of the church. When they reached the chapel doors, the congregation was already seated. The pews were packed tight, sweaty, smelling of rose water and cheap cologne and spite. And there, at the altar, stood Silas Thorne. He wore a new black broadcloth suit. His dark hair was brushed back. He looked like a mountain carved out of stone, unmovable, unshakable. He didn't look at the crowd. He was looking at the door, waiting for her. In his rough, calloused hands, he held a single yellow wildflower, a Texas star. Mercy walked down the aisle. Every step echoed on the pine floorboards. Nobody smiled. Nobody played the piano. The silence was heavier than the heat. In the front row, Hester Hale, the preacher's beautiful, educated daughter, was pressing a lace handkerchief to her mouth, weeping quietly, mourning the loss of a fortune she believed was hers by right. Mercy reached the altar. Silas looked down at her. He didn't smile, but his gray eyes softened. He knelt down on one knee, down in the dust, right in his expensive suit. He held out the yellow flower, not to Mercy, to Toby. Toby took it, his little fingers brushing Silas's massive hand. Toby smiled. Silas gave a slow, firm nod. Then he stood and faced the Reverend. Reverend Josiah Hale looked like he had swallowed a mouthful of ash. His face was flushed. The Bible in his hands trembled. He looked at Silas, then at Mercy, with absolute disgust. "Mr. Thorne," Hale said. His voice echoed in the quiet church. "Marriage is a sacred covenant. It requires consent. It requires voice. Given your condition, your inability to speak the vows before God, I must ask, are you certain of this? Are you certain this woman hasn't pressured you into this arrangement?" A collective gasp swept through the pews. The Reverend had said the quiet part out loud. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't look at the crowd. He just reached into his jacket. He pulled out the small slate chalkboard. He pulled out a piece of white chalk. He didn't write a paragraph. He didn't explain himself. He pressed the chalk to the board. He pressed so hard the muscles in his jaw locked. He wrote 2 words. "I do." He pressed so firmly on the final line that the chalk snapped in half. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot in the silent chapel. He turned the board around. He held it up for Reverend Hale. Then he panned it slowly, left to right, showing it to the entire congregation, to the banker, to the judge, to Hester. "I do." The message was clear. "I am a man in full possession of my mind. I am making my choice. and my choice is her. Reverend Hale swallowed hard. He had no legal ground to refuse. He opened his Bible. He read the vows quickly, stumbling over the words, rushing to get the disgrace over with. I pronounce you man and wife. No one clapped. No one stood. Silas put his board away. He offered Mercy his arm. She laid her hand on his sleeve. The dark wool felt rough and real under her scarred fingers. Together they turned and walked back down the aisle. They stepped out into the blinding sunlight. Silas's wagon was waiting, a team of massive black draft horses. As they climbed in, a man stepped out of the shadows of the mercantile awning. It was Elias Crane, the old Quaker who ran the dry goods store. He took off his flat-brimmed hat. He pressed it to his chest. Mrs. Thorne, Elias said quietly. Welcome. The only man in town decent enough to use her new name. Mercy gave him a tight, grateful nod. Silas flicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the dusty, hateful town of Fort Griffin behind. They rode for an hour in silence. The land opened up, wide golden seas of prairie grass waving in the wind. The sky was painfully blue. Toby fell asleep on the wooden bench, his head resting on Mercy's lap. He was still clutching the yellow flower. Mercy looked at the man sitting beside her, the man who had just made himself an enemy of everyone he knew, just for her. Why? She whispered. The wind almost carried the word away. You didn't answer me the other day. Why did you do this? Silas pulled back on the reins. The wagon rolled to a slow stop under the shade of a lone live oak tree. He set the brake. He pulled out his board. He wrote for a long time. The scratching of the chalk was the only sound besides the wind in the grass. He handed her the board. I watched you for a year, Mrs. Thorne. It was the first time he had written her new name. Her heart gave a strange, hard thump. I watched you wash the blood off the saloon girls' dresses when no other woman would look at her. I watched you return $3 to Mr. Briggs when he overpaid you, even when your boy was hungry. You have washed the dirtiest things in this county, but your eyes are clean. You look at every pair of hands exactly the same. Mercy stared at the white dust on the black slate. I cannot tell you yet why that matters to me, Silas wrote below it. But it does. You are safe now. You are done washing their dirt. Mercy didn't cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't. But a single tear broke loose and tracked through the dust on her cheek. She didn't hand the board back, she just folded her hands over it, holding it to her chest. Silas released the brake. He clicked his tongue at the horses. They rolled on toward Thorn Acres. And for the first time in 2 years, Mercy felt something she thought she had lost forever. She felt safe. The first thing you notice about Thorn Acres isn't the size of it. It isn't the miles of fencing or the massive stone house sitting like a fortress on the ridge. It's the quiet. It's a different kind of quiet than the silence of a dead town. It's a living quiet. The wind in the pecan trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of saddle leather. It's the sound of a place that doesn't need to shout to prove it exists. Mercy woke up with a start. It was pitch black. Her internal clock, trained by years of brutal poverty, screamed at her that it was 4:30 in the morning. Time to get up. Time to light the fire. Time to boil the water. Time to pour the lye. She swung her legs out of bed. Her feet hit a braided rug, not a dirt floor. She stopped. The memory of yesterday rushed back. The chapel, the snapped chalk, the wagon ride. She was in a bedroom twice the size of her entire laundry shack. A massive mahogany bed, clean white linen sheets that someone else had washed. She looked at her hands in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. The cracks were still there, but they weren't burning. She stood up and walked out into the hallway. Toby was asleep in the room next door, in his own bed. He was buried under a patchwork quilt, breathing soft and easy. No cough. Mercy walked downstairs, letting her hand trail along the polished wood of the banister. There was a light in the kitchen. She stopped in the doorway. An older man with a silver mustache and a limp was standing at the cast-iron stove. Enoch, the ranch foreman. He was pouring a cup of coffee. black as pitch. He looked up at her. He didn't seem surprised. He just reached for a second tin cup. He poured it full and pushed it across the scarred wooden table. "Morning, ma'am," Enoch said. His voice was like gravel. "Morning, Enoch," Mercy said softly. She wrapped her hands around the hot tin. I'm used to being up." The back door opened. The hinges whined softly. Silas stepped inside. He smelled like horses, leather, and cool morning dew. He had already been working for an hour. He took off his hat and hung it on a peg. When he saw Mercy sitting at the table in her simple cotton wrapper, he stopped. He didn't frown, but his brow furrowed. He walked over to the mudroom wall where a small slate hung on a nail. He wrote quickly and brought it to the table. "You don't have to wake this early. This is not your laundry." Mercy took a sip of the coffee. It was strong and bitter. It tasted wonderful. "Old habits, Mr. Thorne," she said. She gave a small, tired smile. "My hands don't know how to sleep past 4. Silas looked at her hands wrapped around the cup. He reached out. For a second, Mercy thought he was going to touch her. Instead, he took the cup gently from her grip. He walked over to the stove, grabbed a small tin of beeswax and tallow salve and set it on the table in front of her. He tapped the tin with his rough finger, looked her in the eye, pointed at her hands. "Heal." That's what the gesture said. He didn't need to write it. After breakfast, the sun came up, painting the Texas plains in shades of fire and gold. Silas took Mercy and Toby out to see the place. It was a strange, beautiful tour. No words were spoken. Silas led the way. He pointed. He demonstrated. He took them to the massive barn. He let Toby pet a gentle old mare. Toby's eyes were wide as saucers. He had never been this close to an animal that didn't belong to someone who might yell at him for touching it. Silas watched the boy. He leaned against the stall door, his arms crossed over his chest. He pulled his small pocket slate. He wrote a line and handed it to Mercy. "Your boy. Does he remember his father?" Mercy looked at Toby, who was giggling as the horse lipped at his palm. "A little," she said softly. "He was only 5 when William died of the fever. He remembers a beard, a laugh. He doesn't remember much else." Silas nodded slowly. He took the slate back, wiped it on his denim thigh, and wrote again. "I will never ask him to call me anything he does not choose. He may call me Silas, or Mr. Thorne, or nothing at all. That is his choice. He is safe here." Mercy read the words. A lump formed in her throat, hard and sharp. This was the one thing she hadn't dared to ask for. The one thing she feared most. That this powerful, silent man would demand obedience from a fatherless boy. Instead, he offered freedom. "Thank you," she whispered. Around noon, the quiet of the ranch was broken by the rattle of an approaching wagon. Mercy tensed. She instinctively stepped half behind Silas, expecting trouble. Expecting Reverend Hale or the sheriff or some angry mob from town. But it was a buckboard wagon, painted a faded green. Driving it was a woman as broad as a barn door, with hair the color of spun sunshine and a smile that could blind you. "Min Shara," the woman boomed before the wagon even stopped rolling. "Now you have neighbor! Finally!" She vaulted down from the wagon seat with surprising grace. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. It smelled like warm yeast and honey. "I am Ingrid Carlson," the woman said, marching right up to Mercy and grabbing her by the shoulders. She gave Mercy a hug that nearly cracked her ribs. 3 miles that way." She pointed a thick finger toward the eastern ridge. "I bring bread, Swedish bread, good for the soul." Mercy blinked, overwhelmed. Thank you, I'm Mercy." Ingrid laughed loudly. "I know who you are. Whole county knows who you are today." Ingrid glanced over her shoulder. Silas had stepped away to talk with Enoch near the corral, giving the women space. Ingrid leaned in close. She smelled of flour, sweat, and pine soap. "Town is angry," Ingrid whispered, her thick accent making the words sound jagged. I hear them at the mercantile. They say bad things. The preacher, he is a snake in the grass. You hear me?" Mercy nodded slowly. "I know." "Good." Ingrid patted Mercy's cheek with a flour-dusted hand. "You ignore them. They are angry because he did not pick their spoiled girls. Because he picked a real woman, a worker." Ingrid tapped her own chest proudly. "We work, we build, we survive. I come every week. You are not alone now, yes?" "Yes," Mercy said. And for the first time in 2 years she laughed. It felt rusty in her chest, but it was real. That night, the house settled into a deep, peaceful dark. Mercy tucked Toby into his bed. She stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching his chest rise and fall. He was safe. Her boy was safe. She walked down the long upstairs hallway. At the far end, a thin line of yellow light bled out from beneath the door of Silas's study. Mercy stopped. She didn't knock. She just stood there in the quiet hall. Through the thick oak door, she could hear a sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was the sound of a steel-nibbed pen moving furiously across heavy paper. It wasn't a casual letter. It was the heavy, relentless rhythm of a man pouring his soul out in ink. She remembered what he had written in the wagon. "I watched you wash the dirtiest things in this county." He was carrying something. Something heavy enough to crush a normal man. Something that had stolen his voice and locked it away in a dark box. Mercy rested her palm flat against the wood of his door. She didn't push it open. She just let her hand rest there, the healed skin pressing against the grain. "Whatever it is," she thought to herself in the quiet dark, "whatever ghost you're fighting in there, I'm going to help you wash it clean." She turned and walked to her own room. She climbed into the soft bed. And for the first time since her first husband died, Mercy Thorne slept through the night. It started raining on a Tuesday. Not a gentle autumn rain. This was Texas rain. It came down in sheets of solid gray. It hammered the tin roof of the barn. It turned the prairie into a shallow, freezing lake. For 3 days and 3 nights, the sky just poured out its misery over Thorne Acres. Silas didn't stop. He couldn't. He was out there from before dawn until long past dark, working alongside Enoch and the ranch hands, driving the cattle up to the high ground, digging trenches in the freezing mud to keep the water away from the foundation of the house. Mercy watched him from the kitchen window. She saw a man punishing himself, pushing his body past the point of exhaustion. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she wrapped a thick wool shawl around her shoulders. She poured a large mug of black coffee, covered it with a tin plate to keep the rain out, and walked out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her down. The mud sucked at her boots. She found Silas near the corral. He was soaked to the bone. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. He was using a heavy iron pry bar to clear a jammed drainage gate. Mercy walked up beside him. She tapped his shoulder. He spun around, surprised. He looked at her, then at the steaming mug she was holding out. He didn't have his chalkboard. He just looked at her face. The rain was washing down her cheeks. He took the mug. Their fingers brushed. His hands were freezing. Hers were warm. He drank the coffee in 3 long, desperate swallows. He handed the mug back, gave her a single tight nod, and pointed toward the house. "Go back inside." She did, but she knew something had shifted, just a fraction. An hour later, the rain finally stopped. The silence that followed was heavy. The air smelled of wet earth and bruised sage. Mercy was in the kitchen, wiping down the table, when she heard it. A low, deep rumble, like thunder coming from the ground. Then came the shouting. "Mr. Thorne! Silas!" It was Enoch's voice, frantic. Mercy ran out to the porch. Toby was right behind her. Silas was already sprinting across the muddy yard, heading toward the eastern ridge behind the main barn. The hillside had given way. The sheer weight of 3 days of water had turned the earth to soup. A massive chunk of the ridge had slid down into the gully, leaving a gaping, jagged wound in the earth. Mercy hurried up the slope, holding her skirts out of the mud. When she reached the edge, she stopped dead. Enoch was standing there, staring down into the collapsed earth. He had taken his hat off. Silas was standing next to him. His face was completely devoid of color. He looked like a dead man breathing. Mercy looked down. Bones. Hundreds of them. Rib cages. Skulls with heavy, curving horns. Leg bones fractured and stained brown by the dirt. It was a mass grave of slaughtered cattle. And right in the center of the bone pile, unearthed by the mudslide, was a heavy iron strongbox. The lock was rusted solid. But the stamped lettering on the lid was still perfectly clear. Property of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Silas didn't move. He just stared into the pit. Mercy didn't ask questions. She didn't scream. She took Toby's hand, pulled him gently away from the edge, and sent him back to the house. Then she walked up right beside Silas. She looked at the bones. Then she looked at her husband. "I'll boil some water," she said quietly. "Come inside when you're ready." So, night fell. The house was freezing, despite the fire roaring in the hearth. Toby was asleep upstairs. Mercy sat in the leather armchair in Silas's study. The only light came from the fireplace and a single oil lamp on the heavy oak desk. Silas sat across from her. He had washed the mud from his hands, but he couldn't wash the ash out of his face. He held his slate chalkboard on his lap. He had been staring at it for 20 minutes. Finally, he picked up the chalk. He didn't write short sentences this time. He wrote small, filling the board, erasing, writing again. It took a long time. The only sound in the room was the desperate scratching of the chalk. When he finally stopped, his hand was trembling. He turned the board around and held it out to her. Mercy took it. She held it close to the lamplight. 1872, the board read. "I was a scout for the 4th Cavalry. I spoke Comanche. I was good at it, too good. They sent me to a band of 80 Nakota Comanche. I was ordered to convince them to move to a new reservation territory. I told them the land was good. I told them there was water, game. I gave them my word." Mercy swallowed hard. She kept reading. "I didn't know the water was poisoned. I didn't know the land was dead. 31 of them died that first winter. 14 were children. The colonel knew. He wanted them moved because a cattle syndicate was paying him to clear the range. I used my voice to march them to a graveyard. The chalk lines were thick and jagged, pressed so hard they dug into the slate. 2 years later, I went to work for that same cattle syndicate. I didn't know. When I found out the truth, I didn't leave. I told myself it was already done. I was complicit. The syndicate slaughtered the cattle meant for the Comanche treaties to starve them out. They buried the evidence here. I helped dig the pit." Mercy stopped. She looked up at Silas. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring into the fire, bracing himself for the judgment, waiting for her to stand up in disgust, waiting for her to pack her bags. She looked back down at the final lines on the board. "When the syndicate went bankrupt, I bought this land. I bought it so no one else could build on top of these bones. I swore I would never use my voice again, because my voice was a weapon that killed children. I have lived on top of this graveyard for 6 years, alone." Mercy set the chalkboard on the desk. The silence in the room was suffocating. Silas closed his eyes, defeated. He had laid his darkest, ugliest sin on the table. And now he was waiting for the executioner's axe. But the axe never fell. Instead, he heard the soft rustle of cotton. He opened his eyes. Mercy was kneeling on the rug in front of him. She didn't offer him hollow comfort. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. That would have been an insult to the dead. She knew what guilt was. She knew that some stains don't wash out no matter how hard you scrub. She reached out. She took his massive, trembling hands in hers. "I married a man carrying the weight of the world," she whispered. Her voice was steady, grounded. "I didn't know what you were carrying yesterday, but I know today." Silas stared at her, disbelief warring with a desperate, starving hope. "And I am still here, Silas." She squeezed his fingers. Her own hands, rough and scarred from years of boiling other people's filth, holding his. "I'm still here." Silas let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He looked at this woman, this washerwoman the whole town despised. She wasn't running. She wasn't flinching from the dark. She was sitting in the ashes with him. Something broke inside Silas Thorne, a dam that had held back a river of guilt for 6 long, agonizing years. He looked at her hands holding his. He looked into her eyes. He opened his mouth. His throat worked. The muscles strained. It was a physical agony. His vocal cords were stiff, rusted, atrophied from half a decade of absolute silence. He fought for the breath. He fought for the sound. "Yes," he whispered. It was a terrible sound, hoarse, gravelly, like a rusted iron gate swinging open in an abandoned cemetery. Just one word. "Yes. Yes, I am broken. Yes, I am guilty. Yes, I need you." Mercy didn't gasp. She didn't make a fuss. She just let go of his hands, leaned forward, and wrapped her arms around his neck. She pulled his head down to her shoulder. Silas buried his face in her collarbone. The silent king of Thorn Acres, the richest man in the county, holding on to a widow like she was the only solid thing left on earth. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The silence in the room wasn't a punishment anymore. It was a pardon. December came in like a knife. The wind off the plains turned bitter and sharp, cutting through wool coats and stinging exposed skin. But the weather was nothing compared to the chill waiting in Fort Griffin. The mudslide had forced Silas to stay near the ridge, working with Enoch to shore up the collapsed earth and quietly rebury the past. They worked in silence. Sacred work. Because Silas couldn't leave the ranch, Mercy had to go into town for the winter provisions. Alone. She drove the buckboard wagon herself. Toby sat beside her, bundled in a thick blanket. They rode into town on a Sunday morning. It wasn't by choice. It was the only day the mud had frozen hard enough to let the wagon wheels roll without sinking to the axles. As she drove past the Methodist church, the tall wooden doors were propped open to air out the sanctuary. The congregation was packed inside. Mercy didn't mean to listen. But Reverend Hale's voice was built to carry. It was a booming theatrical baritone that rolled out into the street. "And the scripture warns us, brothers and sisters," Hale thundered. "It warns us of the woman who comes by stealth, the woman who creeps into a household with the guile of Jezebel." Mercy pulled back slightly on the reins. The wagon slowed. "Not with swords does she conquer," Hale's voice echoed off the storefronts, "but with false pity, with soap and water. I say to you today, when a wealthy man, a man afflicted by God with a silent tongue, is taken by a clever, destitute woman, the community must ask." Inside the church, the congregation murmured in agreement. "Who profits?" Hale demanded. "Who speaks for him when he cannot speak for himself? We must guard our flock against the wolves who wear the clothes of the poor." Mercy sat frozen on the wagon seat. Jezebel, that's what they were calling her. The preacher was using the pulpit, the very word of God, to paint her as a predator, to protect the town's wounded pride because Silas hadn't chosen one of their own. "Mama?" Toby asked, his little voice muffled by his scarf. "Is he yelling at us?" Mercy snapped the reins. "No, baby, he's just yelling at the wind." She drove down to Elias Crane's Mercantile and set the brake. When she pushed the heavy wooden door open, the bell above it jingled merrily. The store smelled of roasted coffee beans, leather, and peppermint sticks. It was warm, but the temperature inside dropped 10 degrees the moment Mercy stepped over the threshold. Standing by the bolts of calico cloth were 3 women, Mrs. Briggs, the banker's wife, Mrs. Halloran, the sheriff's wife, and the judge's sister, the pillars of Fort Griffin society. The women stopped talking instantly. Mrs. Briggs, wearing a velvet-trimmed coat that cost more than Mercy's entire shack, looked at Mercy from head to toe. Her lip curled. Then, in perfect unison, the 3 women turned their backs. They didn't walk away. They just stood there, their backs facing her like a physical wall. "I hear she doesn't even sleep in the main bedroom," Mrs. Briggs whispered to Mrs. Halloran. She didn't bother keeping her voice down. It was a loud, theatrical whisper meant to inflict pain. "A tragic arrangement," Mrs. Halloran whispered back. "One wonders what she's truly after. He can't even cry out for help." Mercy felt the heat rise in her cheeks. The old instinct, the instinct of the poor and the downtrodden, screamed at her to look at the floor, to apologize for existing, to grab her supplies and run. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath. She walked right past them. Her spine was so straight it could have snapped. Her boots clicked sharply on the floorboards. She walked up to the counter where Elias Crane was weighing out flour. Elias looked at her. He looked at the women's backs. His jaw tightened. He tipped his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Thorne," Elias said, his voice loud and clear. "Good to see you. I set aside that winter wool you asked for, the heavy grade." "Thank you, Mr. Crane," Mercy said. Her voice didn't shake. "I'll need a sack of coffee beans, too, and some peppermint for Toby." Elias smiled, a real smile. "Coming right up." As Elias packed her order, the three society women huffed in indignation, gathered their skirts, and swept out of the store, leaving a cloud of suffocating rosewater perfume behind them. Elias handed Mercy her packages. He leaned over the counter. "You watch your back, Mrs. Thorne," the old Quaker murmured. "Hale is organizing the deacons. He's talking about a church intervention, calling into question Silas's mental state. In this town, symbols mean everything." "Let them talk, Mr. Crane," Mercy said, picking up her bundles. "Talk is cheap." But as she walked out to the wagon, she found out just how expensive talk could be. Standing by the head of her lead horse was Hester Hale. The preacher's daughter was beautiful, perfect blonde hair pinned under a stylish felt hat. A wool riding habit dyed a deep, expensive green. She looked like a painting, but her eyes were red-rimmed and bitter. "Mrs. Thorne," Hester said. The name sounded like poison on her tongue. "Miss Hale," Mercy replied, stopping short of the wagon. Hester looked at Mercy's hands holding the wrapped bundles, the fading red scars, the calluses. "I waited 5 years," Hester said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. 5 years for him to come to my father's house, to ask for my hand, like a proper gentleman. He never did. And now I understand why." Mercy didn't say anything. She just waited. "He was waiting for someone like you," Hester spat. "Someone who wouldn't expect him to be a gentleman. Someone easy." Mercy set her bundles in the back of the wagon. She turned to face the younger woman. "I didn't take him from you, Miss Hale," Mercy said evenly. "He was never yours to begin with." Hester's face flushed a furious red. Tears welled in her eyes. "I know that. That's what makes it so unbearable. He chose. Out of every woman in this county, he chose you. A woman who boils rags for a living. Not a woman who sat across from him in a parlor and treated him like a king." Mercy looked at Hester. And to her own surprise, she didn't feel angry. She felt a profound, crushing wave of pity. "Miss Hale," Mercy said softly, "you wanted a king. Silas doesn't want to be a king. He just wants to be a man." Hester stared at her, her chest heaving. Then she turned on her heel, gathered her expensive skirts, and marched back toward the church. Mercy climbed into the wagon seat. Toby was looking at her with wide, worried eyes. "Mama?" "Yes, Toby." "Why are all the ladies so mad at you? Did you wash their clothes wrong?" Mercy took the reins in her scarred hands. She looked down at her son. "No, Toby," she said. "I didn't wash their clothes wrong. They're mad because they think we took something that belongs to them." "Did we?" "No." Mercy clicked her tongue, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the cold, judgmental streets of Fort Griffin behind. "Listen to me, Toby. People in this world will try to tell you what you're worth. They'll look at your clothes or your hands or where you sleep, and they'll try to put a price tag on you." Toby listened, his brow furrowed. "But our dignity," Mercy said, her voice rising above the rattle of the wagon wheels, "our dignity doesn't live in their mouths. It lives right here." She tapped her chest. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise." 2 hours later, the stone house of Thorn Acres came into view. Silas was standing on the front porch, waiting. He stepped down into the yard as the wagon pulled up. He reached up, taking Toby down first, swinging the boy easily to the ground. Then he offered his hand to Mercy. His grip was strong, warm, calloused. He looked at her face. He saw the fatigue. He saw the tight set of her jaw. He knew exactly what the town had done to her. He pulled his small chalkboard from his pocket. He wrote one word. "Hale?" Mercy stepped down from the wagon. She didn't let go of his hand. "Yes," she said. "Hale, and the rest of them. They won't stop, Silas." Silas looked toward the horizon, back toward the town. His gray eyes turned the color of flint. His jaw locked. He didn't write anything else. He just pulled her gently against his side, wrapping a heavy arm around her shoulders. They stood there in the yard. The wind howled around them, trying to find a way in. But here, on this land, with this man, the wind couldn't touch her. The town of Fort Griffin had drawn its battle lines. The elite had declared war on the silent rancher and his laundress bride. But as Mercy leaned her head against Silas's shoulder, she knew one thing for certain. They had picked a fight with the wrong woman. Winter came down on Young County like a hammer. It was late January, the kind of cold that snaps tree branches in the dark. The wind off the plains felt like broken glass against your face. You didn't go outside unless you had to. They were sitting by the hearth on a Tuesday evening when the dog started barking. Silas stood up. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He walked to the window and wiped away the frost. A lone rider was coming up the drive, a young county deputy. The boy was shivering so hard he could barely hold the reins. Silas opened the door before the boy could knock. The wind howled into the house, bringing a handful of dry snow with it. The deputy didn't come inside. He just reached into his heavy wool coat. He pulled out a thick envelope, cream-colored paper, sealed with red wax. "From the church deacons, Mr. Thorne," the boy said. His teeth were chattering. "I was just told to deliver it." Silas took it. He handed the boy a silver dollar for the ride, nodded toward the barn where the boy could warm his horse for a minute, and shut the door. He walked back to the fire. Mercy was watching him. She had a pile of mending in her lap. She set it down. Silas broke the wax. He unfolded the paper. He read it once. Then he read it again. The muscle in his jaw began to twitch. It was the only sign of the rage boiling up inside him. He handed the letter to Mercy. She read it out loud. Her voice was steady, but the words were poison. "To Mr. Silas Thorne, you are hereby summoned before the Board of Deacons on the 28th of this month. You will answer for the irregularities of your recent marriage. Furthermore, given your continued refusal to exercise the gift of speech, the board must address the community's grave concerns regarding your mental fitness. We must determine if you were coerced into this union by an indecent woman taking advantage of a crippled mind. Failure to appear will result in immediate excommunication and the revocation of all community standing." It was signed by Reverend Josiah Hale and 4 of the wealthiest men in town. Mercy set the letter on the side table. They weren't just calling her a gold digger anymore. They were calling her a predator. And they were calling Silas a fool, an invalid. They were going to use his silence to strip him of his dignity, and use the church to strip her of her name. Silas reached for his chalkboard. He wrote fast, angry. "I will go. I will stand in front of them." "And do what?" Mercy asked quietly. "Let them talk over you?" Silas wiped the board. He pressed the chalk down hard. "I will use my voice. I will tell Hale exactly what he is." Mercy looked at him. She thought about the night of the mudslide, the agony in his face when he forced out that single word. Yes. His voice wasn't a tool right now. It was an open wound. If he used it in that church, fueled by rage, Hale would just twist it. Hale would say he sounded like a madman. She stood up. She walked over to him and put her hand over the chalkboard. "No," she said. Silas looked up at her. His eyes were stormy, furious. "If you stand in that church and shout at them, you give them exactly what they want," Mercy said. "They want a spectacle. They want to see the silent king lose his mind over a washerwoman. They want to prove you're broken." Silas's chest heaved. He wrote one word on the edge of the board. "Then? You fight them with the one thing Reverend Hale is terrified of," Mercy said. "The truth. on paper. She went to his massive oak desk. She pulled out a fresh stack of heavy parchment. She set an inkwell on the blotter. She laid out his best steel-nibbed pen. "You wrote down the truth for me," she said, "about the cattle syndicate, about the Comanche, about 1872. You told me the government buried it. You told me the town's elite profited from the land grab." Silas stared at the blank paper. "Hale is using God to hide his greed," Mercy said. "So, shine a light on it. Write it all down. Every name, every date, every stolen acre. And we don't just send it to the deacons. We send it to Washington." Silas sat down at the desk. He looked at the pen. It was a dangerous game. Confessing to a federal crime, even one orchestrated by a corrupt colonel, could mean prison. It could mean the gallows. It would definitely mean painting a target on his back. He looked over his shoulder. Mercy was standing by the fire, the woman who had scrubbed the town's filth for a year without complaining, the woman who had looked at a mass grave and decided to stay. Silas picked up the pen. He didn't sleep that night. For 8 straight hours, the only sound in the house was the scratching of the steel nib. He didn't hold back. He detailed the forced march of the Nakota Comanche, the poisoned water, the 31 dead, the cattle syndicate that paid the army to look the other way. He detailed how the banker, Mr. Briggs, had handled the syndicate's money, how the judge had signed the bogus land deeds. He wrote an 8-page confession, a masterpiece of cold, hard facts. At the very end, he wrote a final paragraph. "I am summoned by my local church to answer for marrying a woman they deem beneath me. I will not appear. Instead, I offer this full confession to the federal government. Let the church attack my marriage. But if they do, they must also answer for the blood money that built their sanctuary. Let both be weighed together. Or let neither be." He signed it. Silas Thorne. The next morning, the wind had died down. The sun was blindingly bright on the snow. They drove the wagon into town together. Silas didn't go to the church. He drove straight to Elias Crane's mercantile. The old Quaker ran the town's postal drop. Elias was sweeping the boardwalk. He stopped when Silas and Mercy stepped down from the wagon. Silas handed Elias 2 thick envelopes. One was addressed to Reverend Josiah Hale. The other was addressed to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Washington, D.C. Silas didn't need his chalkboard. He just looked Elias in the eye. He tapped the Washington letter. Then he tapped the counter. "Make sure it goes." Elias looked at the addresses. He looked at Silas's face. The old man understood exactly what he was holding. He was holding a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse. Elias took his hat off. "I'll put it on the noon stage myself, Mr. Thorne. You have my word." They drove back to the ranch, and they waited. The 28th of January came. Silas did not go to the church. Mercy watched the road all day, half expecting a mob with torches, half expecting the sheriff with a warrant. But nobody came. The 29th came, then the 30th, absolute silence. The next time Mercy went into town for flour, she walked past the church. Reverend Hale was standing on the steps. He saw her coming. For the first time since she had arrived in Fort Griffin, Reverend Hale did not glare. He did not preach. He turned his back, opened the heavy church doors, and practically fled inside. Mercy smiled, a small, tight smile. The elite of Fort Griffin hadn't found grace. They hadn't forgiven Silas. They still hated the washerwoman who had stolen their prize. But they were cowards. Faced with a man who was willing to burn his own life down just to expose their corruption, the cowards chose to stay quiet. The threat of excommunication vanished, like breath on a cold window pane. Winter finally broke, but spring brought no relief. It brought a drought. April came and went without a single drop of rain. The Texas plains turned the color of old straw. The dirt baked into a hard, cracked crust. The wind picked up the topsoil and threw it against the windows of the stone house all day long. It sounded like sandpaper. By the middle of May, the creek had dried to a muddy trickle. By the end of May, the main well near the barn started pulling up brown sludge. Water is blood in cattle country. Without it, you're dead in 2 weeks. Silas didn't wait. He and Enoch took the heavy picks and shovels and walked 200 yards out past the tree line. They found a low depression in the rock table, and they started to dig. It was brutal work. The sun beat down like a physical weight. Silas swung the pickaxe until his shoulders screamed. Enoch shoveled the dirt into a bucket, and Mercy hauled it up with a heavy hemp rope. They worked from dawn until dusk for 4 straight days. At 30 feet down, the air in the shaft was cool and damp. Silas swung the pick. Crack. It didn't sound like dirt. It didn't sound like limestone. It sounded like glass. He knelt in the dark at the bottom of the hole. He ran his calloused fingers over the rock. He pulled a chunk loose and held it up toward the circle of sunlight above him. It was quartz, heavy, veined with something else, something dull and yellow. Silas closed his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't shout with joy. He just rested his forehead against the cool dirt wall of the well. Gold. Most men would have scrambled up that rope hollering that they were rich. But Silas knew better. Gold wasn't a blessing. Not out here. Gold was a disease. It made good men crazy and bad men lethal. It brought vultures. He put the rock in his pocket. He kept digging. 2 feet later, they hit water. Cold, clear, and sweet. That night, Silas set the rock on the kitchen table. The oil lamp caught the veins of yellow. Mercy touched it, her scarred fingers tracing the rough edges. "Is there more?" she asked softly. Silas nodded. He wrote on his slate. A vein, running east under the pasture. Could be small, could be massive. Who else knows? Only Enoch. But secrets don't live long in dry dirt. He was right. 2 weeks later, the dog started barking again. Mercy was on the porch, showing Toby how to whittle a whistle out of a piece of soft pine. She looked up. A buggy was rolling up the drive. Not a ranch wagon. A shiny black buggy with red spoked wheels. A man stepped down. He wore a tailored gray suit that had never seen a day of hard labor. He had a bowler hat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His accent when he spoke was pure Boston. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the man said. He touched the brim of his hat. "I'm looking for the owner of this property. A Mr. Silas Thorne." Silas walked out of the barn. He stopped at the edge of the yard. He didn't approach the man. He just stood there, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Ah, Mr. Thorne, I presume." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a leather case. He handed a crisp white card to Silas. Silas didn't take it. The man awkwardly lowered his hand. "My name is Cyrus Platt," he said smoothly. "I represent the Northern Texas Mineral Company. We've been conducting some geological surveys in the area, water table assessments, and we've picked up some very interesting anomalies on your eastern ridge." Platt smiled. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a lamb. "I'll be frank, Mr. Thorne. We believe there is gold-bearing quartz on this property. I am authorized to offer you $50,000 for the exclusive mineral rights. A fortune, sir. More money than a cattle rancher could see in 3 lifetimes. Silas didn't blink. He pulled his chalkboard from his back pocket. He wrote 3 words, "Not for sale." He held it up. Platt's smile faltered for a second, then snapped right back into place. "Now, Mr. Thorne, let's not be hasty. Let a man speak. You see, if you refuse, things could get complicated." Platt reached into his buggy and pulled out a thick leather folder. "My company has friends in the land office," Platt said, his voice dropping the friendly pretense. "We've reviewed your homestead patent. The 1876 survey markers on your eastern boundary don't match the current federal filings. It's a technicality, of course, but if we contest your claim in federal court, it could tie this land up for years. You could lose the whole ranch. This offer of $50,000, well, it's a courtesy, to save us all the headache." Platt looked at Silas. Then he looked at Mercy, sitting on the porch in her faded dress. "Take the money, Mr. Thorne," Platt sneered. "Buy your wife a proper house. You're a mute. You can't fight a corporation in federal court." Silence hung over the dusty yard. Silas slowly put his chalk away. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. He started to reach for the folder in Platt's hand. "Don't touch that," a voice said. Platt turned around. Mercy had stood up. She walked down the porch steps. She didn't hurry. She walked right up to Cyrus Platt. "Mr. Platt," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, cold. "You represent the Northern Texas Mineral Company?" "I do, ma'am." Platt looked amused. "Though I don't discuss business with the domestic help." Mercy didn't flinch. "I am Mercy Thorne, half-owner of this property, and you are a liar." Platt's face went stiff. "Excuse me?" "You said the 1876 survey markers don't match the federal filings," Mercy said. She crossed her arms over her chest. The sun caught the white scars on her knuckles. "That would be concerning, if it were true." She took a step closer to him. "But under the Homestead Act of 1875, Section 4, a boundary dispute on a patented claim cannot be contested by a third-party commercial entity unless there is a prior overlapping claim filed within 6 months of the original survey. Your company didn't exist in 1876, Mr. Platt." Platt stared at her. His mouth actually fell open a fraction of an inch. "Furthermore," Mercy continued, her voice ringing clear across the yard, "the survey markers on the eastern ridge were certified by a federal surveyor and witnessed by 2 adjoining landowners. I know, because I read the deed 3 times before I put my name on it. There is no loophole, there is no discrepancy. You have no legal standing to contest this property in federal court or any other court." Silas watched his wife. The corners of his eyes crinkled. He was trying very hard not to smile. Platt's face turned an ugly, mottled red. He realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had looked at her faded dress and scarred hands and assumed she was stupid. He didn't know she was a preacher's daughter from Virginia who had read the law library of the men she used to wash clothes for. This is absurd," Platt stammered. "A washerwoman trying to quote property law." "This washerwoman is telling you to get off her land," Mercy said, "before my husband decides to show you what else he doesn't need a voice to do." She nodded toward Silas. Silas dropped his hand to the walnut grip of his Colt revolver. He didn't draw it. He just rested his hand there. Platt swallowed hard. He snatched his folder back. He practically scrambled into his buggy. "You haven't heard the last of this," Platt spat, snatching up the reins. "The company gets what it wants, remember that." He whipped the horse and tore down the drive in a cloud of white dust. Mercy stood in the yard watching him go. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt a large, warm hand settle on her shoulder. She looked up at Silas. He didn't write anything. He just looked at her with a mixture of absolute awe and deep, profound respect. "He'll come back," Mercy said quietly. "With the sheriff, or worse." Silas nodded. He knew. "What do we do about the well?" she asked. "About the gold?" Silas looked out toward the eastern ridge, toward the new well they had nearly killed themselves to dig. He looked at the dry, dying grass. Then he looked at his wife and his boy on the porch. He pulled out his slate. "We cap it." Mercy read the words. "You want to bury it? $50,000? "It's cursed money," Silas wrote. "It brings men like him. It brings the town out like vultures. We have enough to survive. I won't trade our peace for yellow rock." Mercy looked at the chalk letters. Then she looked at the man who had written them. She smiled, a real, brilliant smile that lit up her tired face. "All right," she said. "Let's get the shovels." That night, under the light of a silver moon, the richest rancher in Texas and the laundress who loved him walked out to the pasture. They took heavy wooden planks and sealed the well. They shoveled dirt over it. They buried a fortune in the ground. They didn't need it. They had already found something worth keeping. June brought a heat that made the air shimmer. It was the kind of heat that made the horses restless. It baked the ground so hard a horseshoe would ring off it like an anvil. And it brought Cyrus Platt back to Thorn Acres, just like Mercy said he would. They saw the dust trail a mile out. Silas was mending a bridle on the porch. Mercy was teaching Toby his letters on the small chalkboard. They all stopped. They watched the dust cloud get bigger. It wasn't a buggy this time. It was a half-dozen riders. Silas set the leather down. He stood up. He didn't rush inside for a rifle. He just unbuckled the leather thong, holding his Colt revolver in its holster, letting it hang loose. "Toby," Mercy said softly. "Go inside. Stay away from the windows." The boy scrambled into the house. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. The riders pulled into the yard. Cyrus Platt was in the center, riding a rented roan. He was sweating through his fine gray suit. Beside him rode a man with a silver star pinned to his canvas vest, a United States Marshal. Behind them were 4 more men, hired guns from town. And lingering near the property line, sitting in their buggies where it was safe, were Reverend Hale, Banker Briggs, and Judge Lewis, the town elite. They had brought a picnic lunch to watch Silas Thorne lose his kingdom. Platt dismounted. He looked smug. He looked like a man holding a winning hand. The marshal stayed in the saddle. He looked at Silas. Then he looked at Mercy. He didn't look happy to be there. "Mr. Thorne," the marshal said. His voice was gravelly. "I'm Marshal Calder, Federal District Court out of Dallas." Silas didn't nod. He just stood on the top step of the porch, a wall of muscle and quiet rage. The marshal pulled a folded paper from his vest. "I have a court order here. It grants the Northern Texas Mineral Company the right to survey your eastern ridge, pending a review of your homestead boundaries. You are ordered to comply, sir, by federal law." Mercy stepped forward. "Marshal," she said, her voice steady, "we showed Mr. Platt the deeds. There is no boundary dispute. This is a harassment suit filed by a corporation trying to steal private land." Platt laughed. It was a nasty scraping sound. "I told you, Marshal," Platt sneered. "The man is an invalid. He lets a washerwoman fight his battles. It's pathetic, really. A woman who spent her life scrubbing the dirt out of other men's trousers, trying to read federal law." Down by the fence line, Reverend Hale and the banker chuckled. The sound carried on the hot wind. Silas's jaw tightened. The knuckles on his right hand went white. "Stand down, ma'am," the marshal said, not unkindly. "I don't write the orders. I just enforce them. We're going to ride out to that ridge. If your husband interferes, I am authorized to arrest him. And if he pulls that iron he's wearing, my men will put him in the ground." The hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands resting casually near their holsters. Platt took a step toward the porch. He looked right at Silas. "Let's end this farce, Mr. Thorne," Platt said. "Tell the marshal whether you'll comply. Go on. Defend your land. Use your own voice. Oh, wait. I forgot. You don't have one." Platt spat into the dirt at the bottom of the steps. "You're nothing but a crippled coward hiding behind a skirt," Platt hissed. "Move aside." He took another step up the stairs. Silas moved. It was terrifyingly fast. 1 second he was standing still. The next he was down the steps, standing toe-to-toe with Cyrus Platt. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. He grabbed Platt by the lapels of his expensive suit and hoisted him onto the tips of his polished boots. The hired guns drew their weapons. 4 hammers clicked back, loud and sharp. "Hold your fire," the marshal barked. But his hand was on his own gun. Mercy's heart stopped. She saw the men down by the fence line leaning forward. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Silas Thorne shot down in his own yard. Silas didn't look at the guns. He didn't look at the marshal. He looked at Cyrus Platt. He thought about the silence he had kept for 6 years. He thought about the dead. But then he thought about Mercy, standing alone against a town that hated her, defending a man who wouldn't defend himself. He wasn't going to let them humiliate her. Not today. Not ever. Silas tightened his grip on Platt's coat. He drew in a breath. It rattled deep in his massive chest, and for the second time in his life, the Silent King broke his vow. His voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. It came out like the grinding of tectonic plates, low, resonant, absolutely terrifying. "This land is mine." Platt's eyes went wide with shock. He stopped struggling. The hired guns froze. Down at the fence line, Reverend Hale actually dropped his walking stick. Silas pulled Platt an inch closer. "This woman is my wife." Every word hit like a physical blow. "This boy is my son." Silas shoved Platt backward. The mining agent stumbled down the stairs and landed hard in the dust. Silas looked up at Marshal Calder. His gray eyes were burning. "Get out," Silas said. "Now." It wasn't a request. It was an execution order. The sheer, overwhelming force of a man who had kept his soul bottled up for half a decade, finally letting the cork out. Marshal Calder looked at Silas. He looked at the dust where Platt was scrambling to his feet. He looked at the perfectly legal homestead deed Mercy was still holding in her hand. The marshal slowly took his hand off his gun. "Holster your weapons," the marshal ordered his men. "Arrest him!" Platt shrieked, dusting off his ruined suit. "He assaulted me!" "Shut up, Platt," Calder snapped. "The man defended his property. I've seen enough here. Your company wants this land. You send a federal judge, not me. We're riding out." The marshal tipped his hat to Mercy. "Ma'am." He turned his horse. The hired guns followed. Platt, sputtering and furious, had no choice but to climb onto his roan and ride after them. Down by the fence, the buggies of the town elite were already turning around, beating a hasty retreat. The show was over, and the lion wasn't dead. The dust settled. Silas stood in the yard. His chest was heaving. He rubbed his throat. It felt like he had swallowed broken glass. Mercy walked down the steps. She didn't say a word. She just stepped into his arms. Silas wrapped his arms around her. He buried his face in her hair. He was shaking. The man who had just backed down a federal marshal was trembling like a leaf. That night, the house was quiet. Toby was asleep. Silas was sitting in his leather chair by the unlit hearth. The summer heat was still heavy in the room. Mercy came downstairs. She wasn't carrying mending. She was carrying a piece of paper. She walked over to the hearth. She struck a match against the stone. Silas watched her. She held the paper up. It was the contract. The 1-year agreement he had written out in her laundry shack. $500 and a wagon. "April has come and gone, Silas," she said softly. "The year is almost up." Silas stood up. He reached for his pocket slate, panic flaring in his eyes. He thought she was leaving. Mercy put her hand over his pocket, stopping him. She touched the match to the corner of the contract. The dry paper caught instantly. The flame curled up, turning the legal words into black, fragile ash. She dropped it into the hearth. They watched it burn together. "I never signed that paper," Mercy said. She looked up at him. "I said I do in front of God, in front of a town that hates us. That's the only contract I recognize." She reached up and touched his rough cheek. "You broke your vow today," she whispered. "You broke it for me." Silas shook his head. He didn't reach for the slate. He just looked at her. He touched his own chest, then pointed to her. "We." "Yes," she smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "We." He didn't speak again that night. He didn't need to. He picked her up in his arms easily, as if she weighed nothing at all. And for the first time since she had arrived at Thorn Acres, he carried his wife up the stairs, to the main bedroom, where she belonged. July in Texas is a crucible. The prairie grass turns brittle, the creeks turn to cracked mud, and the sky takes on a hazy, bleached-out blue that hurts your eyes. But the worst part of July isn't the heat, it's the dry storms. They woke up just past midnight. The air in the bedroom was thick, oppressive. Silas sat up first. He smelled it before he saw it. Smoke. He threw off the sheet and ran to the window. The eastern horizon wasn't black. It was glowing, a jagged, angry orange line cutting across the night. Lightning had struck the high ridge. The dry grass had caught, and the wind was blowing straight toward the ranch. Silas didn't write anything. He just looked at Mercy. She was already out of bed, pulling on her boots. "Get Enoch. I'll get Toby." 10 minutes later, the yard was chaos. Silas, Enoch, and the 5 ranch hands were soaking burlap sacks in the horse troughs. The roar of the fire was getting louder. It sounded like a freight train rushing across the plains. The sky was raining gray ash. Mercy brought Toby out to the front porch. She wrapped him in a wet woolen blanket. "You stay here, Toby," she commanded. "You don't move from this spot, do you hear me?" Toby nodded, his eyes wide with terror reflecting the orange sky. Mercy tied a wet bandana over her nose and mouth, grabbed a soaked grain sack, and ran toward the eastern fence line to join her husband. It was a losing battle. A prairie fire is a living, breathing beast. It creates its own wind, it jumps fences, it swallows 100-year-old oak trees in seconds. They beat at the flames with the wet sacks. The heat blistered their faces. The smoke stung their eyes blind. "It's too wide, Mr. Thorne," Enoch shouted over the roar. "We can't hold it. It's heading for the new barn." Silas knew he was right. They were 7 men and 1 woman against a wall of fire a mile wide. He looked toward the main road leading to Fort Griffin. In a normal town, the church bells would be ringing. The volunteer bucket brigade would be riding out. Neighbors would come to save neighbors. Silas squinted through the smoke. There was a glow coming from town, but it wasn't lanterns coming their way. The elite of Fort Griffin were standing on the second-story balconies of the hotel. They had stepped out of the saloon. They were standing on their porches. They were watching the fire. And they were doing nothing. Reverend Hale, Banker Briggs, the ladies who had turned their backs on Mercy at the Mercantile. They were letting Thorn Acres burn, hoping the fire would finish the job that Cyrus Platt couldn't. Silas felt a bitter, cold rage settle in his stomach, right beneath the blistering heat. He turned to Mercy. He grabbed her arm and pointed toward the stone house. "Retreat! Let the outbuildings burn! Save the family!" But before they could pull back, a sound cut through the roar of the fire. The thunder of hooves, not running away, running toward them. Silas turned. Coming over the southern ridge, riding fast through the smoke, was a dozen men on horseback. Leading the pack was Nakota, the old Comanche rider. Behind him were 11 young men from the reservation borders. They rode bareback. They carried heavy leather blankets soaked in creek water. Behind them came a rickety buckboard wagon. The horses were lathered in sweat. Ingrid Carlson was driving, whipping the reins, her blonde hair flying. Her husband was in the back throwing out shovels. And riding just behind Ingrid was Elias Crane, the old Quaker storekeeper wearing his flat-brimmed hat, carrying a stack of wet horse blankets. And bringing up the rear, riding a big gray gelding, was Sheriff Halloran. He wasn't wearing his badge. He was carrying an axe. Silas stared. The smoke burned his eyes, but it wasn't the smoke making them water. Sheriff Halloran pulled up hard, his horse rearing. He threw the axe down to Enoch. "Don't just stand there, Thorne," Halloran roared over the fire. "Where do you want the trench?" They didn't have time for thank yous. For the next 6 hours, they fought a war. Nakota and his men rode the edge of the fire line, using their wet leathers to beat down the flare-ups. Ingrid swung a shovel like a lumberjack, digging a fire break in the dirt alongside Mercy. Elias Crane, a man of peace, fought the flames with a savage intensity. They fought side by side. The Comanche, the Swedish immigrants, the outcast storekeeper, the lawman, the mute rancher, and the washerwoman. The outcasts. The true tribe of Young County. By dawn, the wind finally broke. The fire choked on the dirt trenches and died out, leaving a smoking, blackened wasteland behind. Silas leaned on his shovel. His arms were numb. His face was covered in soot. His clothes were singed. He looked around. The old barn was gone, reduced to a smoldering pile of black timbers. The eastern ridge had collapsed completely under the heat and the frantic trench digging. The new well, the well with the gold-bearing quartz, was buried under 50 tons of scorched earth and rock, lost forever. But the main house stood. The horses were safe in the pasture, and his family was alive. Mercy walked over to him. Her face was streaked with ash and sweat. The wet bandana hung loose around her neck. She looked exhausted. She looked beautiful. Nakota rode his pony over to them. The old Comanche looked at the ruined eastern ridge. He knew what was buried there, not just the gold, the bones. The fire had scorched the earth clean. Nakoda looked at Silas. He gave a single slow nod. A warrior recognizing a warrior. Then he turned his pony and rode back toward the south, his men following silently behind him. Ingrid slumped against the wagon wheel, passing a canteen to Elias Crane. Sheriff Halloran wiped his forehead with a filthy sleeve. He walked up to Silas and Mercy. "Hale tried to stop us from riding out," Halloran said. His voice was hoarse from the smoke. "Stood in the middle of the street. Said it was God's judgment on a wicked house." Halloran spat into the ash. "I told him God doesn't start fires to settle real estate disputes," the sheriff said. He looked Silas in the eye. "I read that letter you sent to Washington, Thorne, a few months back, before Hale had the postmaster try to bury it. I know what you did in '72. Silas stiffened. "I don't judge a man for the orders he followed in a bad war," Halloran said quietly. "I judge him by what he does after. You stood your ground for this woman, and you didn't sell out to Platt. That's good enough for me." Halloran tipped his hat. "I'll send a deputy out tomorrow to help clear the deadwood, ma'am." He walked away to get his horse. Silas and Mercy stood alone in the center of the blackened yard. The sun was coming up, a blood-red sphere rising through the smoke. Silas reached into his pocket. Miraculously, his slate hadn't broken. He wiped a layer of greasy soot off it. He wrote a few words. He handed it to Mercy. "We lost half the ranch. The gold is gone." Mercy looked at the board. She looked at the smoldering ruins. Then she looked back at the town of Fort Griffin in the distance, the town that had watched them burn. She took the chalk from his fingers. She flipped the board over. She wrote one sentence, firm and clear. "We didn't lose anything we needed." Silas read the words. A slow, genuine smile cracked through the soot on his face. She was right. The town would never forgive them. The elite would always hate them. They would always be the outcasts of Fort Griffin. But as Silas looked at the Swedish woman sharing water with the Quaker, and the lawmen riding home in the dawn light, he realized something profound. They didn't need the town's forgiveness. They had built a family out of the ashes, and nobody was ever going to tear it down again. September rolled in, cool and quiet. It had been exactly 1 year. 1 year since the richest man in Young County walked into a boiling hot tin shack and handed a chalkboard to a widow. Thorn Acres looked different now. The old wooden barn was gone. In its place stood a new one, smaller but built out of heavy river stone. Nakoda's men had hauled the rock. Elias Crane had ordered the mortar at cost. They built it to last. The eastern ridge was still covered in black soot from the fire. The well and the fortune in gold buried at the bottom of it was sealed under 50 tons of earth. They never mentioned it. They never picked up a shovel to dig it back out. They had made their choice, honest labor over cursed money. As for Cyrus Platt, he was gone. He was currently sitting in a federal courthouse in Dallas, answering to a judge about mail fraud and forged land patents. Turns out, a well-written letter from a preacher's daughter carries a lot of weight in Washington. Out behind the smokehouse, Mercy was on her knees in the dirt. She was digging. Beside her was Ingrid Carlson, sweating and smiling, holding a bundle of young apple saplings. "The dirt is black," Ingrid said, packing the earth around the roots of a tiny tree. "But it is good. Fire makes the ground hungry, yes? It grows back stronger." Mercy smiled. She reached out and patted the soil flat. She looked at her hands. The angry, peeling red skin was gone. The raw chemical burns from the lye soap had faded. There were scars, yes, white, thin lines crisscrossing her knuckles, but the skin was soft now, loved, healed. The back door of the house creaked open. Silas walked out. He was holding a piece of heavy stamped parchment. He walked over to the new orchard. He handed the paper to Mercy. He didn't have his slate. He just waited. Mercy wiped the dirt from her hands on her apron. She unfolded the paper. It was a property deed, officially stamped by the county clerk. But it didn't say Silas Thorne, sole owner, anymore. It read, Silas Thorne and Mercy Thorne, joint owners. In the event of death, inheritance passes to Tobias Calloway Thorne. Mercy's breath caught. She looked up at the giant of a man standing in front of her. "Silas," she whispered, "this is half of everything. You didn't have to do this." Silas reached into his vest. He pulled out the small slate. He had already written his answer. "It is not a gift. It is an acknowledgement. You didn't just save this land from the fire. You saved it from the dark. It is yours." Mercy stood up. She didn't cry. She just carefully folded the paper, slipped it into her apron pocket, and put her arms around his waist, leaning her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. The next morning was Sunday. They hitched the wagon. Silas wore his black suit. Mercy wore a new dress, not faded black, but a deep, rich indigo blue. Toby sat between them, his hair slicked down, a spelling primer tucked under his arm. They drove into Fort Griffin. The town was awake. People were standing on the boardwalks, outside the mercantile, outside the bank. Just like a year ago, they watched. And just like a year ago, they whispered. The town of Fort Griffin hadn't miraculously seen the light. The elite still thought they were better than the Laundress. Banker Briggs still scowled. The society women still looked down their noses. They never forgave Silas Thorne for his choice. Grudges live a long time in Texas. But as Silas stopped the wagon in front of the Methodist church and helped his wife down, something was different. The whispers weren't loud anymore. They were hushed, uncertain. Reverend Hale was standing at the church doors. His face was stiff. He looked older, tired. He saw Silas and Mercy walking up the steps. Hale didn't smile, but he didn't preach either. He stepped aside. He gave a short, jerky nod. A surrender. Silas didn't nod back. He just walked past the man. He offered Mercy his arm. She took it. They walked down the center aisle of the church, heads high, spines straight. They didn't care who was staring. They didn't need the town's permission to be there. They didn't need their forgiveness. They had walked through the fire, and they had survived. The opinions of cowards couldn't touch them anymore. They sat in the front row, and they owned it. That evening, the sun set over the western ridge, painting the prairie in shades of violet and bruised gold. Mercy was standing on the front porch. It was her favorite time of day. The air was cooling off. The crickets were starting to sing. Out in the yard, Toby was tossing a stick for a stray hound Nakota had brought over. Silas walked up the porch steps. He had just finished checking the horses. He smelled of hay and saddle leather. He came up behind her and rested his hands on the porch railing right next to hers. They stood there in the quiet. Then Silas turned his head. He looked at her. He didn't reach into his pocket. He didn't pull out the chalkboard. He just looked at the woman who had scrubbed the dirt of the world from her hands, only to take on his. And for the third time, the final time, he spoke. His voice was a low, steady rumble. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a roar of defense. It was a promise. Stay. Just one word. Stay. Mercy looked up at him. Her eyes crinkled at the corners. She didn't say yes. She didn't need to. She just slid her hand across the wooden railing and wove her fingers securely through his. The town of Fort Griffin never forgave Silas Thorne. They never forgave him for bypassing the preacher's daughter and choosing the widow with the lie-cracked hands. Some folks just can't stomach a mirror being held up to their own pride. They held on to their bitter little grudges for a long time. But eventually they had to bow their heads, because the thorns were there to stay. Silas and Mercy didn't live their lives trying to change the town's mind. They lived to prove how little those minds mattered. Because healing isn't about making the scars disappear. It isn't about making your enemies love you. It's about learning to smile, to build, to stand tall in the sunlight, wearing every single one of those scars as a badge of honor. And if you rode past Thorn Acres on a quiet Sunday evening, you wouldn't hear a man defending his choices. You wouldn't hear arguments or pleas for acceptance. You would just hear the wind in the orchard, the laugh of a growing boy, and the profound, unbreakable silence of a man and a woman who had finally found their way home.
The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations. And so, when the dust finally settled over Thorn Acres, what remained was not the echo of scandal, nor the shadow of judgment, but something far rarer on the frontier. Peace earned the hard way. What began as a bargain between a silent man and a desperate widow grew into something neither wealth nor reputation could ever buy. In a land where people measured worth by cattle, coin, and lineage, Silas Thorne and Mercy proved that true value lies elsewhere, hidden in quiet acts of courage, in the willingness to stand beside another when the world turns its back, and in the strength to face one's past without running from it. Silas carried a burden that would have broken most men, guilt heavy enough to silence his voice for years. Yet it wasn't punishment that freed him, it was understanding. Mercy didn't excuse his past, and she didn't turn away from it either. She chose to stay. And sometimes that choice, to stay when leaving would be easier, is the purest form of love there is. Mercy, in turn, showed us what dignity truly means. Stripped of status, looked down upon, and spoken against, she never once let the world define her worth. She stood firm, not with anger, but with quiet strength. She reminded us that a person's value is not written in how others see them, but in how they choose to live, to act, and to care. Together they faced a world that doubted them, judged them, and even hoped for their downfall. But in the end, it wasn't power or wealth that saved them. It was truth. It was resilience. It was the kind of love that doesn't need grand words, only steady hands and unwavering hearts. This story leaves us with a simple but powerful truth. Redemption is possible, even for those who believe they don't deserve it. Dignity cannot be taken, it can only be surrendered. And love, real love, is not found in perfection, but in acceptance, sacrifice, and the courage to stand together against the storm. Out on that wide Texas prairie, far from the judgment of Fort Griffin, a man found his voice again. Not because he was forced to speak, but because he finally had something worth speaking for. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes, the right person doesn't just change your life, they give you the strength to face it.